Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTed.com video we're going to be discussing a recent interview from Sony's Santa Monica studio in regards to their take and opinions on the PlayStation 3 as well as the PlayStation 4 hardware, and what they said were the challenges of working with both machines types as well as what they feel will be the future for the machines. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, but just in case you're not, Santa Monica Studios are responsible for the big God of War games, of course, such as God of War 3 and the latest one, of course, Ascension, both of which have been released onto the PlayStation 3 and, more to the point, have been widely acclaimed with their rather impressive graphics on the machine. Beforehand, Naughty Dog, who of course were responsible for Uncharted series, really hold the crown, if you will, in regards to what they can get out of the PlayStation hardware. And indeed, the first time I saw some of the areas on both Uncharted 2, 3, and to a slightly lesser extent 1, I have to admit, my jaw did drop. However, I think it's fair to say that Kratos' own adventures have been pretty graphically impressive, and there have been numerous challenges to actually get that level of quality onto the system. Now, working on the PlayStation 3 hardware itself, as I've mentioned in a few videos in the past, is somewhat of an interesting experience for most developers, and there are a couple of reasons for this. One, of course, as I've mentioned a dozen times over now, is the memory, and one is that the actual graphics systems, the GPU, isn't that up to the scratch, at least maybe not as to the point of, say, they would have wanted it to be, and so a lot of the work goes down to the cell CPU. Now, the cell CPU has, of course, the main core, as well as the actual SPUs, also known as the Synergistic Processing Units. It's actually very easy to write off such elements as almost like little additions, and they just kind of sit there doing nothing. In actuality, they're actually pretty darn powerful. Indeed, documentations of the cells tell that each of them, that's each of the SPUs. By the way, the SPUs form the SPE. Now, an SPE is the actual SPU, the Synergistic Processing Unit, and a memory flow controller, as well as a few other bits and pieces, including an MFC, which includes DMA and bus interfaces and so forth, but I won't get too much into that. Anyway, regardless, the cell's performance is pretty darn good, to say the least. Indeed, IBM, who of course are partners with this whole thing, say that the SPEs can reach around 98% of their theoretical peak performance, which is pretty damn good, and that's actually running optimized parallel matrix manipulations. Anyway, in terms of the actual G-flops, it's actually pretty nice. To say the least, I was actually fairly impressed when I heard the numbers, as they can hit just around 25.6, so let's assume at 25 G-flops, which is pretty damn nice actually, and that's at 3.2 GHz, and that's with each SPE. Anyway, I know I'm kind of going off the beaten track a little bit, but I wanted to get that out there. I'm not going to go too much into exactly what SPU is on this particular video, but I just wanted to go into the basic premise before we talk about the interviews, since in the interview itself and in the analyses, we're going to be talking a lot about the SPUs. Now, for Santa Monica, they really found that the key, it seems, for the SPUs, or should I say for good performance, is actually making use of these SPUs. Now, if you've heard of MLAA, which is a form of anti-aliasing, morphological anti-aliasing if you want me to be very precise, you'll know that the basic premise behind this is that it helps to smooth the jaggers off of various 3D images. So for example, if you're looking at a wall, this is a classic one, and you're looking at it particularly from a side-on view, or in other words, slightly askew angle, you'll notice that you've got that stepping if you don't enable anti-aliasing. Now, most systems are becoming more efficient with their anti-aliasing methods. Now, previously, what would usually happen is that the actual GPU of the PS3 would be asked to perform these MLAA calculations. Now, the problem with this is that it eats up extra bandwidth on the actual GPU. More to the point, it's saying you need to do this after you've calculated what it looks like. Rather obviously, for anyone who's used to PC gaming, especially early on, you'll know that these calculations are not exactly free. To a lesser extent, the Xbox 360 can get away with it somewhat because of the embedded RAM and just the overall architecture of the GPU. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Xbox 360 does that with MSAA rather than ML. Regardless, Santa Monica said, hey, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to use one of the SPUs, or at least some of the SPUs, and farm off these tasks to those instead of the GPU. This basically frees up the actual graphics processing cycles, and so you can actually use those cycles to do other things, such as, you know, draw more enemies or what have you. And this is a very important step onto actually maximizing the performance of the PlayStation. I'm going to read you an exact quote. A number of culling improvements were made, and portions of code got moved to the SPU towards the end of easing the load on the GPU. We also ran a very extensive tools pass on many of our shaders, trying to eke out a few more cycles. Among the more dramatic things on the art side was the addition of proper, more or less anyway, high dynamic range, or that's HDR, bloom and tone mappings. Anyway, fast forward a few years, and of course GOw Ascension is being released, and so they need to go ahead and push the envelope more. And this is one of the problems with developing for consoles. Nothing against consoles, but the simple fact of the matter is, obviously hardware doesn't change, therefore your programming techniques and or your understanding of the machine has to improve as well. Now, one of the things they did to make the graphics look better was start to remove some of the limitations that they'd added in for God of War 3, and they wanted the artists themselves to have more creativity. One of the ways they did this was to increase the amount of UV sets that were allowed, and they pushed those up to 3 per mesh. This basically adds more detail. This is an aside. This adds a lot more detail. UV mapping is basically a 3D modeling process of actually adding a 2D image on the 3D model. So adding textures and that type of thing. I'm not going to go too heavily into that because, once again, that's fairly extensive. If you're more curious on UV mapping, I suggest you go to a Wikipedia, though I'll probably create a series of videos that's going to go into this stuff more heavily over the next couple of weeks, since we're going to be most likely speaking about it extensively, especially when Xbox Durango / Xbox 720 / Xbox Fusion / whatever the hell it's going to be called eventually has its press conference on May the 21st. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying about earlier, they wanted to increase the quality, and most of this was done by a much better UV sets, and obviously all of that together means that you're actually adding cost. Now, this might sound a bit odd, but as an artist or a creator, and I'm not, by the way, in terms of 3D work, but I do have an understanding of it somewhat, and it's a sacrifice. In other words, think of it this way: when you load up a game, I don't, you know, it doesn't matter which one, but let's just say something difficult to run, say Crysis 3, and we're talking about PC here, obviously. When you go to that graphics menu, assume that your system is borderline able to run it. So, and by borderline I mean it's around mid-range. So you can turn up all the specs, all the graphical options to the highest quality, but the problem with doing that is you're sacrificing frame rate. Suffice to say, if you do the reverse and you reduce the quality of the models or the textures or the lighting or whatever, you are doing the reverse. You're lowering the graphical fidelity at the same time that you're increasing the frame rate or the performance of the game. And this is pretty much the balancing act that console developers have to go with as well. Because obviously speaking, most of the time you have to say, hey, what is the maximum that we can get out of this? Now, it seems that from their point of view, from a graphical, this is a quote, from a graphical technical perspective, to a large degree, God of War Ascension was more refined on the graphical front. Now, they did make numerous changes, and this would be things such as improvements on shadows, on the lighting, on textures, and so forth. But despite this, all these better geometries and multi-layer shaders and everything else, there are certain limits on just how far you can push it. Now, I already mentioned that God of War 3 put some of the strain on the SPUs. However, this time they decided to do even more, and I'll read another quote. I thought we hit 11 in God of War, but Ascension belies that. Ascension also has more game system competing for its GPU and SPU time, a tremendous amount of time we spent under the hood optimizing the system and moving even more of the engine to the SPU. Now, for those of you who have played the game, you'll no doubt be familiar with the item Amulet of Ouroboros. For those of you who don't, it basically allows you to either wither and decay various items, or to actually do the reverse and heal them or make them more shiny and new. And the purpose behind this, of course, is to make certain puzzles dynamic. However, you can imagine that this also puts a hell of a lot of strain onto the actual system, because it's not like this it just suddenly comes free. In other words, you have to actually calculate this stuff. Now, I'm sorry. Now, this is done a couple of ways, but most of it is on the SPU, and I'll read the quote. The material part was unusual, rather simple. The SPUs used to reveal or hide material layers. To reveal or hide objects, we extended this to particle light in every object. We then added time to it, which was a tremendous challenge. Getting our own particle system to work with both advance time and go back in time was quite difficult. Synchronizing the whole scene, with light on and off states, baked physics, destructions, light animations, and post-effects transitions was extremely time-consuming. Now, many other bits and bobs could be talked about here, but I'm not going to give you an entire blow-by-blow account, because, to be honest with you, quite a lot of it is talking about the same type of thing. But one of the things that I think we should highlight here is actually to do with the SPUs and how they are used. Now, it's definitely not just a case of God of War. Other titles say Killzone 3, Uncharted, and so forth. Most of the exclusives, particularly. You'll notice that, well, you may not notice because you're busy, lasering people, but most of the time they have heavy work on the actual PlayStation 3's cell. However, MLAA is very nice, and of course does help to remove images, jaggers, and is very cost effective. However, there is a small problem from this. That is a delay. Now, I did mention bandwidth, but unfortunately there is a 20 millisecond turnaround across the system's SPU once the calculation has been used for the AA. And anyway, I'll read this out to you, just so you understand a little bit better. The optimizations and so forth became 5 to 10% cheaper via some additional optimizations, which came in right after God of War 3 shipped. Now, you'll notice that God of War 3 doesn't actually, Ascension doesn't run at one particular frame rate throughout. Indeed, God of War's frame rate fluctuates. Now, they try to have a minimum of 30 FPS, but they don't actually lock the frame rate to that and say this is what it must run throughout. The reason for that is sometimes you don't need 30 frames a second or 60 frames a second or whatever, because the purpose of this is that, let's say it's a cutscene, or you don't really need, to move around that precisely or whatever. Therefore, the frame rate can go ahead and take a somewhat of a dive. Conversely, If you need to, say, dodge 15 or 20 dudes who are trying to murder you with an axe, you probably want it to be as smooth as possible. So what they basically did was to unlock the frame rate. I'll read out a little quote. We have the option in our engine, but we find that the higher the frame rate, the better the game feels. By unlocking the frame rate, we can achieve 35 to 45 in a lot of places in the game, and their general conception is that the irregular frame rate is disturbing for the player because the animation feels irregular, not very smooth. That would be the case if our frame rate update time, which was the same as our animation time, was locked on the irregular frame rate. It's not locked to anything either. It's floating in relation to with the GPU and ends up being fairly random. And this is by having a randomized animation frame around our average GPU time that we make unlock frame rate work. The noise helped to smooth the visuals. We also have a very heavy camera and object motion blurs, which blend everything nicely. Evidently, more of and this is off quote of course, more of this is very much the standard for many PlayStation developers. And this is one of the reasons it's more difficult to actually develop for the PlayStation 3, and one of the reasons that the PS4 has been so welcomed by developers, because the SPUs are not that easy to work with. Now, I mentioned before that it's quite known that the Durango's move engines, or whatever the next Xbox ends up being called, do the work of what the SPUs can do in one respect, and that's shift data around. And indeed, some developers actually use the SPUs for this task as well. In other words, the SPUs are actually used as a kind of catch-all. Do we need extra physics done? Okay, then SPU time. Do we need more graphical effects done? Do we need more, well, anti-aliasing done? And so forth, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. Indeed, without actually using the SPUs, you're basically making the PlayStation 3 run on only one leg, so to speak. It's not very good. Now let's go on to the PlayStation 4 in this interview. I'll start out with a quote. It's definitely got a share of interesting technologies. Filling up that much memory from disk takes some time. From a technical standpoint, the DDR5 part is perhaps the most interesting to me, but 8GB part makes me pretty happy too, since I think it makes a powerful PR statement. The PlayStation 4 hardware is such a big leap forward in terms of graphic power compared to the PlayStation 3 that we probably wouldn't have to go that far. Most, if not all, of the SPU techniques we developed and used on the PS3 were to reduce the RSX / end quote for a second. RSX is basically the GPU of the PlayStation 3. Continuing the quote, reduce the RSX workload. With the PS4 GPU, we probably wouldn't need those techniques. So obviously, one of the challenges for the team is going to be getting used to this whole architecture shift, and I think that's part and parcel of any changeover. I don't think we've learnt anything particularly amazingly new in this interview. At least I haven't. I'm assuming many of you guys who regularly view me haven't either. But I do think it's a fairly interesting interview, in that I think it just illustrates further that the PlayStation 3 is actually a very powerful system, but it's just one of those examples where it just needs that little bit more TLC than, say, the Xbox 360 does to get the most out of it. Indeed, this reminds me of several other systems along the way. The N64 wasn't exactly a snap to get out of. It had memory access issues, I believe. Well, I've mentioned the Saturn dozens of times over, but that was a pain because of the way it was laid out and so forth. And it was actually the PS2 was a bit tricky as well, but PS3 definitely seems to take the proverbial biscuit. Anyway, I think that does it for this particular video. As usual, I will probably be best to answer your questions on Facebook. I do try my best on YouTube. But anyway, facebook.com/redgamingtech in case you're curious, and obviously youtube.com/redgamingtech. So anyway, you can also check out our website, by the way. A lot of the time I do create accompanying articles, that do follow on to things I've said in the videos. Sometimes I talk about completely different things or different elements to it because, you know, it just makes sense too, because sometimes I forgot to mention something in this particular video and I remember it halfway through, or I can add illustrations or images, and you get the idea. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed it, and I will see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.